calculations and functions in Keyboard Maestro, you can make macros that save you hours of time, like this one that lets me quickly export multiple images from Photoshop with increasing numbers at the end of the name. I also made a macro that instantly creates an email that would normally take several minutes to write. But how do you do this? Before we get to the Photoshop macro, you first need to understand what calculations are and why they're so powerful. I'm going to add the set variable to calculation action. I explained more about variables in my variables tutorial, but basically they just let you store some text that you can use later. So I'm going to call this variable example, and now we can enter a calculation into the field below. So you can see that this is a calculation field because of the C on the right. So a calculation is basically just a number. It's a number or something that will become a number. So 3 is a valid calculation because it's just a number. Now something like 3 plus 4 times 2 minus 58 divided by 99 is also a valid calculation because it will become a number. But adding some text like the letter A would make it an invalid calculation because this is not a number and it won't become a number anymore. There are some exceptions to this though, which we'll talk about later. Now, when we do have a valid calculation, we can see the preview of what that number is below. So you can see this whole calculation here will result in 0.73 and so on. Also, you can do a bunch of fancy math and calculations like taking the square root of a number or doing modular division, but I'll keep this video super simple. You can always read more on the Keyboard Maestro wiki if you want to. But now let me add an action that sets a variable to text this time. So notice how here there is a T on the right side of that field, which indicates that this is a text field. If I put the same thing as before, so literally copying and pasting this text here, you can see the variable will literally get set to this text, so 3 plus 4 times the rest of the numbers here, instead of the result of that calculation. And of course, we can always add other text to a text field that wouldn't be valid in a calculation field, like letters and other characters. Now let's use calculations in an actual macro. So I have Photoshop open on the left here and Finder on the right. And sometimes I have to export multiple images from Photoshop, calling them, say, image 1, image 2, image 3, and so on. So I normally have to come up to File, Export, Quick Export as PNG. And the first one I'd call image 1. And you can see that gets exported to the Downloads folder. And then I need to make some changes to my image and then export the second one as image 2. And I have to repeat this process multiple times. So making different changes to my image and then calling it image 1, 2, 3. Now this is a pretty slow process. So instead of exporting these images manually, I made a macro that does this automatically. So when I run the macro, it prompts me to enter the image name and the number of images I want to export. So in this case, I'll just call it faster version for the image name. And then for the number of images, we can export 5 images. Now, when I'm ready to export, I just press the backtick key on the keyboard. So I'm going to press it right now, and you can see it immediately exports that image to the downloads folder. Then I can make whatever changes I need to the image and then press the backtick key again. And you can see it exports the second version over here. I can repeat this process as many times as I need to, just pressing the backtick key whenever I'm ready to export. And I'll do it a couple more times. And then once we get to the 5th image, the macro will automatically stop. So now we have our 5 versions on the right, having exported them much faster than the manual version. And you'll notice how it adds 1 to the name of the image every time it gets exported. So how do you actually make this macro though? Well, in Keyboard Maestro, the macro has several actions, and I've highlighted the actions that rely on calculations in orange color. So I just went to here. And by the way, you can download all of the macros that I'll show in this video down in the description. But anyway, the macro first prompts the user for an image name and number of images, and it sets those to these two variables here. So then once we get these values from the user, we make a new variable called counter and set it to 1. So this variable is going to contain the number that gets added to the end of the image every time we export. So that'd be something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we'll need to increase this number by 1 each time we export an image. Then below there is a repeat action. Now, normally when you add a repeat action, so repeat here, it has a numeric field that you can change with the arrows. So you can click these arrow keys here to make that number go up or down, or you can type in a number manually yourself. But if you type anything other than a number, then that field will expand and you can enter a calculation here. So you can see the C on the right means this is a calculation field. So notice how in this original repeat action, I used the number of images variable from before. So from up here, we're using that as the number of times we want to repeat the actions within the repeat action below. So in calculation fields, you always refer to variables without the percent signs that you have to use in text fields. So it would be wrong for me to say variable number of images like this. You can see that's red. Instead, we need to refer to it by its plain name. So this is one of the exceptions I mentioned earlier to having text in calculation fields. Text is allowed if you're referring to a variable, but that variable has to contain a number or calculation itself. So to explain what that means, if the user entered 3 for the number of images, then the macro would run correctly because number of images contains 3. It contains a valid calculation. And if the user entered something like 3 plus 3, the macro would also run correctly because 3 plus 3 equals 6, and that would be a valid calculation for this. But if the user entered something like hello, that would not be a valid calculation, and the repeat action would fail because hello is not a numeric value. And notice how when I did that, the text here turned orange. So the action will have orange text and say currently invalid below if you have a variable in a calculation field that contains a value that is not a number, like hello. Now this also happens if you haven't set a variable to a value yet. For example, if I wrote number of images 2, the action would also say currently invalid because number of images 2 doesn't exist anywhere. It hasn't been set to a value yet. Now, even if the text is orange, the macro will still work as long as this variable gets set to a number before the macro reaches this action. But this can be a helpful warning when you're making macros. Now, if the calculation is formatted completely wrong, like if we did number of images plus, it will have red text and say invalid. And the reason for that is that it's expecting a number after the plus. So like number of images plus 2, that would be a valid calculation, but number of images plus by itself is not a valid calculation, even if this did have a numerical value. Okay, but back to the macro at hand. So we prompted the user for a number of images up here and an image name. Then we set a counter variable to the number 1. Then we repeat the actions below for every single image that we need to export. And now let's talk about what those actions are. So the first one is a pause until action. So it's a pause until action with a key condition. So key condition, and I use the backtick key, but you could use whatever you want here. And this is how the macro knows we're ready to export. It waits until the user presses the backtick key, and then it proceeds with the rest of the actions below. So after that, it activates the quick export as PNG menu in Photoshop. So again, that was file, quick export as PNG. And then what the macro does is it pauses until and this was a button condition. So the button condition here, pause until a button with the name save is enabled. So in Photoshop, that was this export window here. You can see it has a save button, and we want to pause until this save button appears. Then once that save button has appeared, we can insert the name of our image. So we put an insert text by typing action that inserts our image name. So using the image name variable from the very top. And then after that, we add a variable, and this one is the counter variable. So the first time we get to this action, we'll type our image name followed by the counter variable, which will contain a value of 1 because that's what we set it to up here. So then once we type out our image name, we press the save button. So we would have typed image 1 or whatever our image name was, and then 1, and then we press the save button. And then what the macro does is it adds 1 to our counter variable. So this is using a calculation. You can see this is a calculation field. We set the variable counter to what counter was before plus 1. So the first time we get to this repeat action, counter will be 1, and we set it to counter, or 1, plus 1, which will make it 2. So you can see if I right click and try this action, it's increasing that number by 1 below every time. So the second time that we get to this action, counter would be 2, and then we set counter to 2 plus 1, making it 3. And then we're repeating this loop until we reach the number of images that the user wants to export, and then the macro finishes. So to demonstrate this one more time, I'll run the macro and call this image name another example. And let's say we want to export 3 images. I'll press OK. And let's change the backgrounds. I'll press the backtick key. It exports with the counter being 1. And then let's do it again. It exports and the counter variable has now become 2. And one more time, let's do green this time. Press the backtick key and it exports with 3 at the end, and the macro has now finished running because we only repeated those actions for 3 times. All right, now let's talk about text fields for a second. So here I use the set variable to calculation action, but it's also possible to use calculations in normal text fields. So I'm just going to add a set variable to text action to show you what I mean. So right now you can see there's the T on the right. This is a text field. You can actually perform calculations within text fields by using the calculate token. So percent calculates percent. And then in these 2 percent signs here, you can enter whatever calculation you want, like normal. So you could say 34 times 333, and you can see that's previewing to a value down here. Now, if you wanted to use variables in a calculation like this, you would refer to them without the percent sign. So you could say something like counter plus 1, and this would be a valid calculation. In the context of this macro, it's probably simpler to use the set variable to calculation action, but sometimes you want to perform calculations in the middle of a bunch of text, where it would make more sense to use the calculate token. So if you wanted to display text every time you were exporting your macro, you might say something like the next counter will be, and then here you do calculate percent, and then you could say counter plus 1. Then every time you got to this calculation within the macro, it would display what the next counter value would be. Of course, if you still want to use a variable outside the calculation token, then you would need to use the regular variable syntax, so something like image name. This variable would need to be referred to with the proper variable syntax since it's not within the calculate token right here. All right, now you know about calculations, but once you combine them with functions, you'll be able to make some even crazier macros. I'll show you 4 examples of macros that use functions. So someone signed up for my coaching program and he was running an automation on a certain website, but he wanted the actions to run with random pauses between them so the website didn't think he was trying to spam. So this is just an example website I made, and I have a simple example here that clicks the mouse first on the text box, and then it pauses for a second, and then it types some text in the text box, then it pauses for another second, and then it presses the submit button to submit that text. So to make these pauses random, we need to use the random function. So remember, if you start typing in a numeric field, it will expand and you can enter a calculation. So you can see the C on the right. So functions are another exception to having text in calculation fields. Now, once I've entered this random function, I can put a number inside the parentheses like 4. Now this will return a random decimal number from 0 up to 4. And you can see a preview of that number below, how it's changing. Now, if we wanted a random number from 2 to 4, for instance, we could do this, which will return a random number from this value to this value. And now you can see below, it's generating random numbers between 2 and 4. So now when we run this macro, the first action will run, then the macro will pause for a random time between 2 and 4 seconds before typing the text below. So similar to calculations, functions just return a number, and that means you can use them inside calculations. So you could type something like random 2 to 4 times 100, and that would be a valid calculation. You can see now I'm getting a random number between 200 and 400 below. Now you can only use functions directly in calculation fields, but if you want to use them in text fields, you again can put them inside the calculate token. So if I wanted to do a random number here, I could do the calculate token, and then inside the percent signs, I can do my random function. And let's say I want a random number between 0 and 100. So now when I run this macro, it will pause for a random time between 2 and 4 seconds before typing a random number in the text field below between 0 and 100. So I'm going to cancel this macro and then come back to Keyboard Maestro. And let's say we wanted a random whole number. So not a decimal, but a whole number between 0 and 100. Well, there's another function for that, which is just the rand function by itself. Also, you can insert functions by going to the Edit Insert Function by Name menu item, or by pressing the shortcut Command Control F. I won't cover all of these, but here you can see the list of all functions in Keyboard Maestro. So we're looking at the rand function right now. What this will do is insert a random whole number between 0 up to, but not including the number you enter. So now if I run this macro again, this time it inserts a whole number instead of a decimal number in the text field. Another function that's maybe even more useful than the last one lets you make a keyboard shortcut that opens an app and moves to the next window of that app when you press the shortcut again. So if I press Control Option X, it will toggle through all the open windows of my browser. So here's how you make a macro like that in Keyboard Maestro. You first have an if condition that uses an application condition, so this one here, and you say if the app that you want to enable is not at the front, then activate that application. Otherwise, if it is at the front, then bring the next window of that app to the front. And the way that you do that is with the window count function. So what this function does is return the number of windows in the front application. So in the case of Brave, it's 4 windows because I have 4 windows open. So that means the window count function would return the number 4. So then all this action does is bring the window with the highest index, aka the last window, to the front. So this is a really useful way to quickly open apps and toggle between windows using the window count function. All right, let me show you another cool use of function. So I had a client who frequently needed to send an email that told his customers how much shipping costs would be if they bought 20 items, 24 items, or 28 items. The shipping costs would change, but he had to use a certain formula to find these numbers. And you don't need to follow this math at all, but for the sake of example, let's just say that 20 boxes cost $900. So to get this number here, you'd have to divide 900 by 0.3. So you can see that's 3,000. Then to get the next number, you have to divide the new number by 20. So you can see that is 150. And then to get the last number here, you had to divide that by 12. And that is 12.5. So you can see how it would take a lot of time to do all this math by hand and type up the whole email, which could get really tedious. However, I helped my client make a macro to write the email instantly. All he had to do was enter the initial costs. So let's say that the cost of 20 items was 900, the cost of 24 was 1,000, and cost of 28 was $1,100. Then pressing enter will spit out that whole email with the appropriate prices and calculations already completed. Now in Keyboard Maestro, I'm not going to explain this macro in depth, but it relied on various functions to do things like rounding numbers or taking the larger number between two values. So this macro not only saved a lot of time, but it also always made sure that the email was 100% accurate, since it eliminated all of the manual calculations that a human could make mistakes on. All right, but now let's use functions for another purpose. So once I had to paste some stuff into a text field that cut off any text longer than 200 characters. So to show what that looks like, I'm going to copy this short example here and paste it in, and that pastes fine. But if I try to copy some longer text that contains more than 200 characters, it gets cut off. So you can see all of this text here got cut off by the text field. However, we can use functions to make a macro that will only paste if the clipboard contains less than 200 characters. Otherwise, it will give a warning so that we know the text will be cut off. So I'm going to run the macro now, having copied some short text, and you can see it pastes fine. But now if I try to paste the long text by running the macro, it gives a warning that says there are more than 200 characters in the clipboard. So now I know that the text will be cut off and I won't lose any information when I try to paste it in. So in Keyboard Maestro, let's make this macro. I'm first going to add an if then else action, and then I'm going to select the calculation condition. Now I can add functions and calculations in this text box, which you can see is a calculation field. So if this calculation is 0, then the if statement is considered false, and it will run these actions down here. If the calculation is not 0, so literally any number besides 0, then the statement is considered true, and it will run these actions right here. So to give an example, I'll add the characters function. So this returns the number of characters in the parentheses. So if I write something like hello directly in the parentheses, then this whole calculation would return 5, since there are 5 characters in hello. However, in this case, I'll put the system clipboard token, which will contain whatever text we've most recently copied. So this effectively will now return the number of characters of whatever we've copied most recently. So if the clipboard contains more than 0 characters, which would make this calculation true, then the if statement would run these actions up here. Otherwise, if there were 0 characters in the clipboard, it would run these actions down here. Now this isn't super useful on its own, but to make the macro that only pastes if the clipboard contains less than 200 characters, all we need to do is add the less than or equal sign with 200 here. So whenever you use things like less than or equal to or greater than in a calculation, this will cause the calculation to return 1 if this statement is true, or 0 if it's false. So in this case, the calculation will return 1 if it is true that the number of characters in the clipboard is less than or equal to 200, otherwise this whole thing will return 0 or false. Now up here, we can add an insert text by pasting action. And in that action, we can just add the system clipboard token. So we're effectively pasting whenever the clipboard is less than 200 characters. Otherwise, we can add an action below to display text in a window that will display text with some warning. So we could say like there are more than 200 characters in the clipboard. So now we have a warning whenever the clipboard contains too many characters. So going back to our text box, if I copy a short example and run the macro, it pastes as expected. And if I copy longer text and run the macro, it gives that warning to let me know that there are too many characters in the clipboard. So now you know how to use calculations and functions in Keyboard Maestro. The algorithm thinks you'll like this video next. Let's see if it's right.